Well, there you go. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Straight Talk by the Experts. This is Mike Graberitz from Step by Step Learning, and I'm honored to be featuring Dr. Tim Shanahan today to talk about teaching kids to read complex text. Now, that's a very interesting topic, Dr. Shanahan. We have you on mute, but certainly you can mute your cell phones on your end or your telephone apparatus. I want to remind you to please also save the date for Dr. Jan Hasbrook on Tuesday, May 15th. That's our next webinar of Straight Talk by the Experts. And that's going to be held at 12 p.m. noon on Eastern Time. And Jan will be discussing the new oral reading fluency norms research her and Dr. Tyndall have just completed recently. And lastly, I just want to remind you all, we are recording this session today, and the recorded session will be sent to each of the registered participants. So you don't have to do anything after this session. You're going to get it automatically from us in an email. And we want to send it to you so you can review the session again and again and also share it with others. Many of our customers are using these webinars as professional development topics to talk about with their teams. So I challenge each one of you to use it at your leisure. Now for today's Straight Talk by the Expert session, we have one of my favorite people, Dr. Tim Shanahan. And I just want to introduce Tim a little bit here because he is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he was the founding director of the UIC Center for Literacy. Previously, he was the director of reading for Chicago Public Schools. Tim's been very busy as he has authored or edited more than 200 publications on literacy education. Now that's a full-time job in itself. His research emphasizes the connections between reading and writing, literacy in the disciplines, and improvement of reading achievement. Tim's been the past president of the International Literacy Association. He's received the presidential appointment to the advisory board of the National Institute for Literacy, and he helped lead the National Reading Panel, convened at the request of Congress to evaluate research on the teaching of reading, a major influence on reading education. He's chaired several federal research review panels, and the list goes on. And recently we just saw him, and if you haven't seen him this week, he was on a panel with Dr. Marilyn Adams and others talking about the new NAEP test scores that have been released and are currently being discussed. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Shanahan. The microphone is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm in Chicago, so it's a little bit earlier for me, but I'm certainly happy to be with all of you. I assume you're all more awake than I am. You can see that my title for this talk has a question mark in it, and the reason for that is that your state, as did many others, have adopted standards requiring that kids be taught to read texts of particular levels of difficulty. And that's something that we haven't done in the past. And so a lot of times when I talk about this topic with teachers, and I tell them that they're supposed to be working with, complex text to meet that standard, to enable those boys and girls to read texts as difficult as your state is saying that you have to, they're telling me, no, that's not what it means, that you're still supposed to teach everybody at their instructional level and so on. And so I'm going to try to answer this question. Are we really supposed to teach kids with complex text? Mike says that the session is going to be recorded and that's available to you. I would also tell you that my slides are always available for this talk, and other talks that I give are always available on my website, Shanahan on Literacy, and I would certainly encourage you to go there both to get the slides and also to read my blog and get all the other resources that are there. So with that, I would like to get us started. And again, Mike mentioned the NAEP scores from last week, so let's just take a moment. I think it's obligatory in educational meetings that we consider depressing educational statistics, and these are depressing. Last week, the scores that we released nationally, the scores were relatively flat, meaning that there was a very slight improvement for 8th graders for the first time in 20 years, and There was no improvement at all for the grade 4 readers in more than 10 years. So it's been a while since we've seen our kids doing better. Pennsylvania specifically saw no improvements at either grade level, as they have not for more than a decade themselves. So the notion that our kids are doing well enough is just not true. We really want to see our kids doing better, and I believe that one of the keys to that is certainly going to be teaching our kids to read texts that are harder than the ones that we've taught them to read in the past. And so it's an important issue. What I'm going to ask you to do in the next, 45 minutes or so is to really rethink reading instruction. Typically, when we challenge you to raise achievement, we usually talk about it as a skills deficiency. You know, you're not teaching enough phonics. You're not teaching the comprehension skills. You're not teaching, the vocabulary skills and so on. The problem when it comes to reading comprehension, however, is that reading comprehension is not really a skilled activity per se. If you try to apply the skills of say something like identifying a main idea, or comparing and contrasting two characters or two ideas, what you find again and again is that those kinds of things play out so differently in each text that you read, that the notion that those are skills that if you know how to do them well, you can just do them with any kind of text doesn't really make sense. Reading is not the ability to answer certain kinds of questions. Reading is instead the ability to make sense of the ideas that are expressed in a text, the ability to negotiate the linguistic and conceptual barriers or affordances of a text. What I mean by that is that when authors put information into a text, they try to use various conceptual and linguistic and even sort of text formatting ideas to communicate the information that they want to communicate. And so, for example, an author that I particularly like is a fellow by the name of John Updike, an old Pennsylvania author. Updike, one of the things that I especially liked about him is that he just seems to always pick the exact word. He's very precise in his wordings of things and picks words that both convey the ideas and the tone that he's trying to put across. Now, as much as those word choices in his case are an affordance that allow him to put his ideas across in the most powerful way possible, you're going to find readers who don't know what those words mean. And so those same affordances become barriers. It doesn't matter if we're talking about word choices like that, or how an author constructs their sentences, or links ideas across a text, or organizes their ideas in the text structures, or does many other things. Those are going to serve as either affordances that good readers are able to take advantage of and make sense of that text so that they can answer any kind of question, or they're going to they're going to be barriers to some readers that block them from understanding the ideas and keep them out of it, and essentially block their comprehension. And again, no matter what kinds of questions. A while back, the ACT, the college testing people, did a study looking at the relationship between being able to answer certain kinds of questions and how well students did, and they found, just like everybody else who's ever looked at this issue keeps finding, that the question types don't matter. In fact, what they concluded was if the texts were easy enough, students could answer any kind of question. In other words, they had the comprehension skills. It wasn't, he can inference, but he can't do that. It wasn't like that. If you could read the text well, you could answer any kind of question. And on the other end, they were finding that if students couldn't read the text well, it didn't matter how easy the questions were or what types of questions they were, the students couldn't answer them. The point is, if you want kids to be good readers, you're going to have to do something revolutionary. You're going to actually have to teach kids how to understand the text that they're asked to read. And we need to ask them to read texts that are going to expose them to these potential linguistic and conceptual barriers so that they can figure out how to get beyond them. Now, before I go crazy here, I want to emphasize how critical it is that we not try to raise text complexity or text difficulty with the youngest readers, with beginning readers. Let's not put an age thing on it, though I'm generally talking kindergartners and first graders. I would say to you that I wouldn't try to raise text complexity, text difficulty any higher than we've had it in the past for children who are reading at a kindergarten level or a first grade level, no matter what their ages are. But if a student is reading even as well as a beginning second grader, again, no matter what the age, at that stage we really don't have to worry so much about text complexity. We can actually start ramping that difficulty up and exposing kids to greater challenges. So, you know, maybe someday we'll change the advice on that, but it's critically important that you not make the text too easy initially. And the reason why I say that is that the youngest readers have to learn how to decode. And the greatest feature of text complexity for beginning readers is the decoding patterns. And so if you make the text more complex early on, what that tends to do is hides from the kids those spelling patterns and their relationship to pronunciations and the sounds and their relationship to the letters and so on. And so we don't want to do that. But once kids can decode as well as a well-reading first grader, then we can start to raise the stakes a little bit and change the kinds of texts that we've worked with kids. Now, it's critically important that as we raise the complexity of text, that we actually change the teaching. And one of the things that concerns me a lot is that there are many publishers and there are many school districts that are saying if the standards want higher text levels, we can provide that. And it's very, very easy. I mean, if you have a book room, just go in and relabel your books and you're done. Yeah, we used to work with this book in fourth grade. We're going to let our third graders work with it now. Boom. That's really simple. Or, if you buy a core program from a publisher, I'm sure they'll be able to show you that they've raised the Lexile levels of the text that they're selling you, and that that's no longer an issue. You'll be meeting the standards with these more difficult texts. The problem is that when the publishers and the school districts do those kinds of things, which of course should be done, teachers often circumvent them. They undermine them. And my classroom observations would tell me these are the four most common ways that we do that when it comes to text complexity. The first one is probably the most common in the elementary grades anyway, and that is to move students to easier text. If you find out your kids are going to struggle a bit with the texts that have been purchased or assigned to your classroom, just moving kids into a different group and putting them with easier books solves the problem for a lot of teachers. Of course, it then means you're not teaching the standards, and you're not giving kids exposure or opportunity to learn how to negotiate those complex aspects of text. So it's problematic. And I want to talk about this one in greater detail. So I'm just going to hold off on it for the moment. We'll set it aside. What else do teachers do when text proves to be complex? Certainly one of the popular things, especially in the elementary grades, is is we read the text to the youngsters. These are texts that we're talking about the kids should be reading. If the teacher's reading it to the boys and girls, that's not a very good way of teaching kids to read, and it's not one that generalizes well to other texts. So, you know, there are situations where reading text to kids make great sense, but it isn't if you're trying to teach kids to read those books. A third thing that teachers tend to do is tell kids what the text says. This you especially see in the upper grades, in content classes. You know, a teacher will tell me that they have a textbook, but they don't use it, that students are allowed to read it if they want to independently, but that the teacher will explain to the kids everything they need to know to pass the science test and to meet the science standards, and so they don't need to read the science book. Again, that kind of approach it gets the information across, but it doesn't teach students how to read that kind of information, how to handle those kinds of texts. And of course, there's the old-fashioned approach, which is to just ignore the problem, to put kids in a complex text and then call on the boys and girls who raise their hands and just keep moving and allow those boys and girls who aren't making sense of the text to languish. I think you'd all agree that these four things are not likely to help kids meet the standards that we're talking about. And so if these are what your teachers are doing, if this is what you're doing, I understand why, but they're not actually helping kids. And so I'm going to have to show you a few ways that we can do better than that. So with that, we're going to move this forward. And we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of teaching kids with easy text, which has been such a popular thing to do. The basic idea has been that kids learn best from texts that are at a particular level, and those levels that have been set for this tend to be pretty easy. Various experts have claimed that if the books are too hard, students won't be able to learn to read them. And so consequently, more than about 2/3 of American teachers say that they teach kids reading at their instructional level rather than at their grade level. In other words, the teachers drop back to easier materials to make sure that these children are learning to read, which I'm here to argue is not the best way to go, and there's a reason why your state has put standards in place that ask you to do a bit more than that. If we go back to where this idea comes from of the instructional level, it comes out of Pennsylvania. There was a fella by the name of Emmett Betts. Betts had been a professor both at Temple University and the University of Pennsylvania. Betts was a reading guru back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And he was the one who came up with the idea that all readers have three levels, that there's an independent level, there's an instructional level, and a frustration level. The independent level being the level at which kids could read text on their own with full understanding and wouldn't need any assistance from a teacher. The instructional level being the level at which there would be a bit of difficulty, a bit of complexity, a bit of challenge, though not as much as we're talking about today. And so the teacher would need to help the youngsters to learn from instructional level text, but it would be the level to teach kids at. That's the level they could learn from the text with a bit of teacher assistance. And frustration level being the texts are so hard for the kids that they shouldn't even be approaching those books with a skilled teacher because they weren't going to be able to learn from those texts. It was Emmett Betts who told us how to measure these levels. It was Emmett Betts who came up with the criteria for determining that somebody was at a particular level. And so in those days, he argued that one should use an informal reading inventory. In other words, have students reading passages, different grade level passages, to find which levels the kids could well, read with fluency, and the level of fluency he argued for was 95 to 98%. So if a youngster was reading a text aloud, they wouldn't make more than 2 to 5 mistakes for every 100 words that they read, and they'd be able to answer 75 to 89% or 75% to 90% of the questions about these passages. And if they could read it that well, then he said that was their instructional level. That was the level you needed to teach these kids at. He also claimed that the research that was done by one of his students, one of his doctoral students, a fellow by the name of Patsy Aloysius Kilgallen, he argued that Kilgallen's research showed that if you taught in this fashion, if you matched kids to books like this in reading, you would increase kids' reading achievement, that you'd get more learning, and that you wouldn't get much learning if you taught kids at the independent or the frustration level. Now, I guess this is a place where I should admit that as a classroom teacher, I taught like this. I tested all my boys and girls one-on-one on an informal reading inventory, and I had multiple groups of kids with different levels of books, and I taught that way, believing that it was the best way to teach. Just as I had been told, and I thought that the reason why people thought I was a good teacher was at least in part due to the fact that I was doing all of this. I wonder if it would bother any of you to find out that Betts and Kilgallen didn't actually do the research that he talked about. Oh, they did research. They just didn't do the research that he described. Something I discovered quite a while ago, and I've got to admit, I was thrown by it. I just couldn't believe that they hadn't even bothered to try this out and test it, whether it worked, by teaching kids with this and seeing whether it actually gave kids any kind of an advantage. They did a study. The study that they did is they gave informal reading inventories to a small group of fourth graders. And what they were interested in was the relationship between fluency and reading comprehension. Years later, when they were interviewed about it, they had no idea where the 75 to 89% for reading comprehension came from. They apparently just made it up. And what they were doing in their study was looking to see how many oral reading mistakes kids could make and still have comprehension in that 75 to 89% range. And what they found was that, it was 2 to 5 mistakes. Well, this is a study that couldn't possibly tell you whether the instructional level actually exists, because they didn't test it. They didn't actually try it out to see if kids learn better when they were taught with those kinds of books. There are a number of studies that have been done in the last 20 or 30 years, however, that do answer that question and that I want to talk to you about. But I'm wondering if any questions have come in, Mike. Are there anything that we need to deal with before I jump into the research?
Yeah, Dr. Shanahan, I had a great question come in just a few minutes ago, and here it is. What do you say to teachers who believe course standards are unrealistic for their students?
Well, I certainly sympathize with teachers who believe that it isn't possible for their kids to learn to do these things. But I've got to say that if we don't find ways of accomplishing these kids are really at a huge disadvantage going forward. Just to give you a few examples, if we look, for example, in terms of text complexity, at the levels of text that our adolescents are reading in high school, they fall so short of what is needed when the kids get just beyond high school that frankly it's in the the 50% of students who, when they get to college, are requiring either some kind of remediation or are just flunking out because they can't do things like read a freshman English textbook. And it's not just that these kids who are going to college who are at a disadvantage. We see very similar things in the workplace for those folks in 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are getting jobs and trying to support themselves without any higher education. And we're seeing in the military very similar kinds of problems. And so, if we care about these kids, we've got to find ways of upping the ante on what we do. I think when I see the test scores that I mentioned, those NAEP scores, people see we've had flat scores for such a long time, there must be nothing we can do. I know Mike in some of his districts has been really successful at getting greater attention to some of these basic foundational skills like fluency and phonics and things, and they've certainly managed to see some gains. I know school districts like mine in Chicago, we raised, I was the head of reading for the third largest school district in the United States. We managed to raise reading achievement during my tenure. So I do believe we can do it, but I certainly understand the fatalism that's crept in. And I do think that one of the things that's holding us back and keeping a lot of these reforms from really catching fire is this: as long as we're going to continually drop back to easier texts that our kids are confronted by, instead of actually showing the kids how to deal with those texts, I think we're going to keep seeing the kinds of low achievement that we've been seeing and the kinds of inability. But I definitely think we can do this, and I do believe that if I can convince you to actually try to meet those standards in thoughtful ways, I think you really can do it. So that would be my answer. With that, I'm gonna jump into this research because I don't want to get us too far behind. We'll take some more questions in a little bit. I'm gonna try to do this very, very quickly, and then we'll close it out with looking at some of the instructional techniques that really do make sense for guiding kids to read those more complex texts. The list of research on this topic is actually not terribly long. I wish there were many more studies, but this is it. And I'll give you a preview. What you're going to see is that the studies support this idea of teaching kids with more complex text. They really do show either that the way we're placing kids now in text either isn't doing any good at all, or it's actually doing harm. So with that, let me just jump into these. The first one listed is a study, and it's really a series of studies done by a fellow named Powell. Powell was a big supporter of the idea of the instructional level, but Powell didn't think that Betts had the numbers right. He thought the criteria were wrong, and that he really dedicated himself to figuring out what the right way to match kids to text were so that they'd really be at their instructional level. Powell did the same kind of study that Betts and Kilgallen had done. He tested students' reading comprehension, found those books that the kids could read with that 75 to 89% comprehension, and then looked to see what their fluency was. Now, the difference between what he did and what Kilgallen did originally was he tested a lot more kids, and he tested kids at a lot more grade levels, so that it wasn't just fourth graders. He looked first grade through eighth grade. So what Powell found was that students were able to tolerate a lot more disfluency than what Betts had claimed. In other words, you could put kids in much harder books for the boys and girls and still get the levels of comprehension that Betts was going for. And so in other words, his argument was, using exactly the same approach that Betts was using, was there is an instructional level, but it's a much harder level than what Betts is claiming. Powell's work is widely cited in the field of reading, but he's always cited as a kook, that, you know, we know the right levels, and then he has these silly levels that he's put forth, even though he put them forth with a lot more data and a lot more looking at kids than went into the original criteria. The second study on the list is a single study. This was done by Colin Dunkeld. Dunkeld was a student of Powell. Dunkeld did a correlational study. He didn't intervene. He didn't, you know, try to really test the instructional level. He just went looking to see what level of text kids seem to learn best from. To do this, he tested a bunch of second graders at the beginning of the school year, found out what their instructional levels were, you know, how well they could read particular books that the teachers were going to use. He monitored the books that teachers used through the year, so he could see what levels of books the kids were being asked to read and what their performance levels were with those books. And he tested the kids again at the end of the year to see how much gain they made. And what he figured out was that the kids who'd learned the most, the ones who'd made the greatest pre to post test gains during second grade, were actually in much harder books than what Betts had predicted. In fact, these kids were starting out in texts where their accuracy levels were in the mid 80%. They weren't in the mid 90%. So in other words, the books were a lot tougher for the kids than was being recommended. And you know, the students' comprehension when they started wasn't as good as what Betts was getting teachers to aim for. But he was finding that the kids essentially in the relatively harder books were learning more. Very similar study done by a fellow named Jorgensen. Jorgensen's study looked at third, fourth, and fifth grade boys, but did something very, very similar, found out what their instructional levels were, then looked to see what levels the kids were actually being taught at by their teachers, and looked to see whether, you know, how close to your instructional level mattered in the gains you made. What he found was that placements, whether the kids were placed at frustration level or instructional level, made no difference, that the kids were doing just as well. And so this idea of teaching kids with instructional level materials wasn't giving students any learning benefit. Hardly worth doing all that extra testing and placement and grouping and so on if it's not benefiting kids. In 2000, Alyssa Morgan and her colleagues actually do the first true test of the effectiveness of teaching kids at their instructional level. She does a randomized controlled trial experiment. She takes, again, second graders. She tests them with an informal inventory. She uses those instructional level criteria that everybody was using, or that so widely recommended. But what she did is, instead of placing everybody at their instructional level, she randomly assigned the students to one of three treatments. One group got placed at their instructional level. So if the youngster was reading at a second grade level, they worked in a second grade book. The second group, they were just like the first group, remember, random assignment. But in this case, the children were placed in books that were 2 grade levels above their instructional level. So clearly frustration level. If you were reading at a second grade level, you'd be put in a 4th grade level book. And the third group, again, the same as the other two. The only difference in this one is they were going to place children in books 4 grade levels above their reading level. The kids who in the past we would have said it's like reading hieroglyphics, you know, they're going to be so frustrated. They do this for a school year. They provide instruction to kids with books at these levels. And at the end of the year, they test the kids to see, you know, the kinds of gains. Now, you know, how this is supposed to come out. The instructional level kids, that first group I talked about, is supposed to make the biggest learning gains because they're placed most advantageously. The group that's 2 grade levels above, they're going to be frustrated, but they'll probably learn something, not as much as that other group. And the third group is probably not going to learn much of anything because they're in such difficult material. Well, you'll be pleased and perhaps surprised to know that all the groups made some gains during this school year, but the group that made the least gains, well, they were the ones placed at the instructional level. They were the ones given the least opportunity to deal with those barriers in the text placed before them. They were the ones who didn't really get the opportunity to learn. The second group, those kids who were placed 2 grade levels above reading level, those boys and girls gained everything that the first group did, plus almost 3/4 of a year more in reading than they did. And the third group, the one that was placed at, I guess we'd argue, ridiculously hard levels, didn't do as well as the middle group, but they did certainly better than the instructional level group. They were about halfway in between the two of them. In this study, what we're seeing is the instructional level didn't help kids, and it actually hurt them by reducing their opportunities to learn, which is one of the reasons why I answered that viewer's question before, saying that I think that we're holding kids back a lot of times by not teaching them with complex text. The O'Connor studies, Renata O'Connor's a special educator. She and her team did a couple of studies, and I think it's important that you know about both of these. She worked with students who were 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders who had IEPs. So these are reading disabled students. The students were, again, tested. They found out what their instructional levels were in traditional ways. They then were going to give these kids one-on-one tutoring, and they were going to tutor them in the pillars. They were going to tutor them in phonics and in fluency and in phonological awareness and in vocabulary comprehension. The students were given the students were randomly assigned to one of 3 treatment groups. One group was a control group. They didn't get any tutoring. The other 2 are going to get tutored. One of them is going to get tutored at their grade level. So the text that they work with in the things that they're learning are going to, if you're a 5th grader, you're going to work in a 5th grade book. The other group is going to work at their instructional level. So again, if they're working on reading comprehension, they'll be in a 1st grade book or a 2nd grade book. She tells us that the best readers in the study were reading at like beginning 2nd grade level. So these are all beginning readers through very beginning of 2nd grade level. Now she gets a different kind of finding than the Morgan finding. I'm not trying to hide anything from you. I'm taking you through all the research on this. O'Connor finds that at the end of the study, the 2 tutoring groups outperformed the group that didn't get tutoring, so the tutoring was working. But she found that the reading level, not the grade level group, the reading level group did best. They made the greatest progress. Now, they were making their progress not in comprehension, but in foundational skills, but those are important. I guess I could just brush this study aside and say these were beginning readers. Remember, the kids who were doing well. In fact, she even says in the paper that the kids who made the gains were the lowest readers, the bottom half. And so these were kids at levels that we were not recommending more complex text for, and that your state isn't requiring more complex text for. But let's not write it off quite that quickly. I think the thing that's interesting, this study is widely cited, but if you look for the second study, you're going to have to, you won't see it mentioned too often. I want to talk about the second study. Second study done by the same research team, second study published in the same journal, so it's certainly accessible. But in the second study, O'Connor comes back and says she had concerns about the first study, that she had found that the teachers, you know, the observations they conducted, the teachers in the study had differed in the kind of ways that they'd handled miscues. When the kids made oral reading mistakes, the teachers did very different things. Some of the teachers, for example, maybe had the kids sounding the words out and figuring the words out. Others might have, you know, told them to look at the pictures or to guess or whatever. And looking at the patterns of that kind of behavior, she was concerned that it was a confound. She was concerned that the kids who did best were getting more of certain kinds of feedback than the other kids were getting. So she decided to replicate the study, to redo the study, but to change something. In this case, what she wanted to change was she wanted to get all the teachers to respond the same way to oral reading miscues. So when kids made a mistake, everybody was going to do the same thing. She goes and does exactly the same study that she did before. This time she finds not what Morgan did. Morgan had found, you know, negative consequences to teaching kids at instructional level. What O'Connor found was it didn't make any difference, that these learning disabled kids learn just as well if they were in a grade level text than if they were in the special reading level text. I know I was in Ohio not too long ago presenting these findings, and at this point, a group of high school boys and girls that were in the room, these were all dyslexic students, they started to cheer. And I looked over to where they were sitting, and their parents were there. Their mothers were crying. And I went over at the end of my talk to see what was going on. And what the kids explained to me is that I had said that they didn't need to work in the stupid texts anymore. Because these are kids who have spent their whole school life being taught with books below grade level, and that I was saying that they actually could read the same books that the other boys and girls did and learn just as much, just as O'Connor found. 2 more studies and I'll be done with this, and we can talk, see if there are any more questions. Melanie Kuhn and her colleagues conducted, again, a series of studies in this case, studies where they initially looked at second graders, but then ended up following them through third grade as well. This is a very large study. Number of school districts took part in it, but essentially one group was taught fluency-oriented reading instruction, FORI, which she and Steve Stahl created, in which you teach children with grade level materials. You don't drop them back to easier materials. And the control group, or the comparison group, was doing guided reading. And so in that system, you test all the kids, you find out their reading levels, you place them in the different levels and so on. So they did a year's instruction comparing this large number of classrooms that were getting taught at grade level with the large number of classrooms that were doing this guided reading. And what they found was a huge different learning outcome difference at the end of second grade, favoring the grade level instruction. It was so successful, in fact, the teachers asked if they could continue the study for an additional year, so they did follow the kids through third grade, and those are reported in other studies. And in fact, the kids didn't just maintain their advantage that they developed in second grade, they actually expanded it. They did even better. And so this is kind of like the Morgan study, that being taught at your instructional level not only didn't not help, but it didn't add anything at all. It actually did harm. And the final study was one that was reported just last year by Lisa Brown and her colleagues. It was a replication of the Morgan study, though this time done with third graders. Unlike Morgan, didn't find a harm from being at instructional level, but found no benefit to it, that the kids taught at grade level did just as well. What I'm telling you is that every study that's been done on this, and obviously the number is growing, every study done on this has found either that being taught at your instructional level was not a benefit, or that in fact it was actually harming kids and holding them back. It seems to me that there are few excuses for teaching kids with such easy material. Now, the question becomes very quickly is, does that mean we can just throw kids into more complex text, that we can just, districts can just buy more complex text and now they've solved the problem? And I am here to tell you, no, that is not the case. There is a reason, why. I'm going to skip a few slides here. There is a reason why we can't do that. I think that teachers, me included, that were bought into this idea of an instructional level, bought it because we've been in classrooms and we know what it looks like when kids struggle to read a text, when they can't read a text on their own, that teachers don't have the knowledge of methods or approaches that actually provide students with sufficient scaffolding to allow them to learn from the text. And so I guess the question I want to ask is it possible to place children in frustration level text that in the past we would have avoided, and to somehow scaffold those interactions with text to provide some kind of support without reading the text to the kids, without telling them what it says, and to get the kids reading, well, at an instructional level, not because we put them in such an easy text, but because we're going to add some support for the kids. And it turns out that there's quite a bit of evidence that we can do that. If you look at that list of studies, this list of studies shows kids being taught with materials that were intentionally, they were placed in frustration level materials where they were going to make a lot of oral reading mistakes, where they weren't going to be able to comprehend the text at the very beginning. And they worked with the students with those texts, raising the students' performance level with the text. In fact, I've really come to believe on the basis of these kinds of studies and this kind of evidence that the instructional level is not a good starting point to work with text with boys and girls. It's a good ending point, that we should be teaching kids to the point where they can answer 75 to 90% of the questions, that we should be teaching kids to the point where they can recognize 95 to 98% of the words in a passage, and then we can move on to another challenging text. And I said every one of these studies did that kind of thing. These two. I found more than 20 such studies. And so let me take a little moment to see if I've raised some questions and can get those answered, and then we will jump into what you can do instructionally. Mike, do we have anything?
Yeah, Dr. Shanahan, I do have a question. I have several I've sifted through, and certainly we're going to open it up in a few minutes. But a viewer or a listener asked this: how do we transition our teaching to supporting struggling readers in complex text if we haven't done it before? I think you're just starting to touch on that now.
We're going to go right into that next. So I'm not going to answer that question right now. I'll answer it in just a couple of minutes. And it takes some work. It's going to take building some confidence to do certain things, but I'll show you how to do some of them anyway.
Someone in our audience had the clairvoyance to ask that question just before you were ready to tee that up. Thank you, Dr.
Yep, well, we're thinking along the same ways. That's a good thing. Anything else?
No, I'll let you continue. Go ahead, Dr.
Okay,
Shanahan.
then let's just jump in. Now, I've got a list here of some of the kinds of scaffolds that can be provided. We're not going through all of these today. And this, I'm not arguing, is a complete list. Each of these are features of text that we could scaffold and can scaffold, and that actually improve kids' comprehension and starts to teach them how to think about text and how to approach text. What I'd like to do is in the time remaining, show you a few practical strategies and insights. And so I'm going to just take us right into the first one of these, which is vocabulary. Now, I'm starting here for the simple reason that I believe that most teachers do this in some form or another, and most textbooks recommend that you do this. And in fact, those studies I was showing you, those scaffolding studies, a number of them, tested the effectiveness of what happens if the author uses vocabulary that's at a particular level. The kid's language development is lower than that. In other words, they don't know the meanings of all those words. What can we do to make it possible for the kids to make sense of that text? And what teachers have done, at least since the 1920s and 30s in the United States, is we pre-teach vocabulary. And frankly, we do the same thing for helping kids to deal with science text and social studies text and health text. If you look at any of those kinds of textbooks, or if you look at the various lessons that teachers put online and give to each other and sell to each other, I think pretty much everybody goes for pre-teaching vocabulary. There's a problem, however, with pre-teaching vocabulary, and that is which vocabulary do we teach? And I think we do the wrong things here. I think we make some mistakes. I think we do things that make sense for teaching vocabulary generally, but they don't necessarily make sense if we're trying to help kids to read complex text. Let me show you what I mean. I've got what I think is a 4th grade text here. And just very quickly, photosynthesis may sound like a big word, but it's actually pretty simple. You can divide it into 2 parts. Photo is the Greek word for light. Synthesis is the Greek word for putting together, which explains what photosynthesis is. It's using light to put things together. You may have noticed that all animals and humans eat food, but plants don't eat anything. Photosynthesis is how plants eat. And this, they use this process to make their own food. And it goes on from there to explain photosynthesis. We're not in an interactive mode, but I'm going to ask you a question anyway. What words do you think the publishing company would recommend that you pre-teach here? Pause to let you think. Photosynthesis is certainly one of them. I would argue that pre-teaching photosynthesis is a big mistake. That doesn't actually scaffold the reading for these boys and girls. It, in fact, takes away any reason to read the text. This is a text that is explaining photosynthesis, that's telling us what that is. And so if you tell the kids what photosynthesis is before they read it, there's no reason to read the text. And in fact, I notice that more and more in things like science classes, that when the teachers pre-teach the concepts, the kids just blow off their reading. They figure it out that there's no point to it. You just need to try to remember to tell the teacher back what she told you. Photosynthesis is a bad word to pre-teach because the author himself or herself is going to explain it. If the author is going to explain the meaning of a word, that should be a comprehension question, not a pre-teaching. And so photosynthesis is a word I would not allow you to pre-teach here. I would say don't do that. If there are any of the words in the explanation that you think the kids are going to have difficulty with, you can explain those, except for synthesis, because that's also defined in there. The students need to actually deal with the text. So what we will give kids vocabulary help, including this pre-teaching, but that would be a bad word to teach. And I've got a second brief passage here. Again, I believe I pulled from 4th grade. Some scientists argued that these gases have heated up our atmosphere. They say global warming will affect our climate so dramatically that glaciers will melt and sea levels will rise. In addition, it's not just our atmosphere that can be polluted. Oil from spills often seeps into the ocean. And I've highlighted 3 words. These are 3 words that these 4th graders may not know, that maybe are candidates for pre-teaching. None of these words are defined by the author, so that isn't the problem. But the question is, can kids figure out the meanings of any of these words from the context? Glaciers is one that many teachers, many fourth grade teachers tell me they think their kids could get. And they say that because one, the glaciers are going to melt, so they must be ice, and two, the sea levels are going to rise if they melt, so they must be really big. And so they think kids are going to know what a glacier is or be able to figure out what a glacier is, despite the fact that the author doesn't explain it. I don't know, you can be wrong on this, but let's say the teacher is correct. If you believe that there's a good chance the kids can figure out the meaning of a word from the context or from morphology, from the meaningful parts of the words, then you shouldn't be pre-teaching that word, even if the publisher recommends it. Kids need the opportunity to try to figure out words in context. Now, I know most programs will give you a lesson or two in that. Here is a worksheet where you get to practice that skill. I'm suggesting every time a group sits down or the class sits down to read a text together, that the teacher should be looking for those words that normally we'd pre-teach, but that frankly the kids might be able to get on their own. And if they think that they can, then those words should become comprehension questions. We should ask the kids. Now, if the fourth grade teachers were wrong in this case and the kids couldn't get glaciers, we're not going to tell them what it means. We're going to take them back to the text and show them how to figure it out. And that's got to happen on a regular basis. That's how kids get better at learning to deal with those kinds of barriers. Now let me jump forward to, I want to give a scaffold to you, a couple scaffolds to you that we normally don't give kids. And I have, if I go right to this slide, I have a sentence that I've pulled out of a fifth grade text. And I didn't pull this randomly, as I'll show you. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. The reason I pulled that sentence out is it is 26 words long. And my sense is that the longer the sentence, the more memory load it places on the youngsters, so it makes it harder. It has 5 commas. That means there's a lot of embedding and a lot of information that you have to coordinate, and that makes it difficult for kids. There are numbers, and there's an acronym, and there are parentheses, and those can all make the sentence seem more formidable to the boys and girls. So my assumption is that the kids are going to have some trouble with this. Oh, and one more thing. Even though there's a verb in this sentence, look where the verb is. It's the word made, the 24th word in the sentence. Usually when we talk to each other, when we're trying to communicate, we make the verb like the second or third word in our utterances so that it's easy to hold it in memory and to use it. Not all languages do that. You folks live in a part of the country where many of the older residents often speak German or know German. German constructions, often the verb is the last word in the sentence, which makes German very difficult to understand for people because, as linguists point out to us, we look for the verb, we try to find the verb, and then we connect everything else up to the verb. That's awfully hard to do if you have to hold everything in memory all the way to the end. English is changing. English is being affected by informational text specifically, and particularly by science text like this one. And the verbs are migrating to the right. They're going deeper and deeper into the sentence. And so kids have trouble making sense of a sentence like this. I'm not suggesting that we pre-teach this kind of a sentence like we pre-teach vocabulary. I'm suggesting that teachers identify these kinds of questions and ask these kinds of sentences and ask questions about them. In this particular case, I might ask a simple question like, what did the IAU do? And so when the kids finish reading this page or this section of the text, along with all the other kinds of questions I'd normally ask, I'd ask about what the IAU did. If the kids can answer it, they didn't have any trouble with the sentence. If they can't answer it, then I need to take them back and do something with the sentence. And what I would suggest, I've got a couple of ideas for this one. One might be just to break the sentence down to you know, in a sense, just informally diagram it. You can see in this picture, you can see why the subject, that blue part, hides the verb that made all the way at the end there. You know, it kind of blocks us from getting to it, showing kids how that sentence works so that they can unpack it and figure out what it says instead of just skipping it. Another possibility is just intensive questioning. Take the kids back to that sentence, have them read it, and then start just intensively questioning them about that sentence. You know, who was it about? Who are they? What did they do? What did they make? When did they do that? You know, all that kind of thing. Let me show one more, and I'll close this up. Texts are not just lists of sentences. They require coherence. The sentences have to link together. We link our sentences in all kinds of ways. You know, one of the most common ones is with pronouns and repetitions and things like that. And so, you know, the seals, you know, lived on this mountainous island. They liked it there because they could easily find fish to eat and stones for their nests, something like that. That kind of a sentence, they connects those two sentences together. They referring to the seals. Well, again, here's a 5th grade passage that I've selected. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it formed a large flat ring around it. Scientists called this ring a protoplanetary disk. The disk or ring was hottest where it was closest to the sun and coolest at its outer edge. As the disk swirled around the sun's gravity went to work. It pulled and tugged at the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas until they came together in clumps of material we now call the planets. Imagine a group of 5th graders reading that, and at the end the teacher asks the question, what is the scientific process that was described there? I can imagine a lot of kids scratching their head and having no idea. I don't think the problem here is vocabulary. I don't think the problem here is that the sentences are so complicated. I think the problem here is trying to follow the chain of coherence. Let me show you what I mean. What I would ask the boys and girls to do with this passage, if they had difficulty with it, would be to find the first scientific concept, and in this one, it's the nebula. And I would ask them to find all the other words that refer to the nebula. So the nebula orbited the sun until it being the nebula, so the nebula orbited the sun until the nebula formed a large flat ring. And then the next idea is the sun. So the nebula orbited the sun until the nebula formed a large flat ring around it, around the sun. The disk was hottest where it was closest to the sun, and the disk swirled around the sun. And then we get to the ring or the disk itself. So the nebula orbits the sun until the nebula forms a large flat ring around the sun. The scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. This ring is hottest where it being the ring, was closest to the sun and coolest at the ring's outer edge. And as the disk or the ring swirled around the sun, well, now we get to the sun's gravity. And the sun's gravity goes to work. It being the sun's gravity, pulls and tugs at the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas. And then we get this last bit. The bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas equals clumps of material equals the planets. Now, I think showing kids how to do that, how to read this kind of text, to connect up those kinds of ideas, is what gives them purchase on making sense of those ideas, instead of just having an on-off switch. Right now, beyond vocabulary, when kids come to a text and start to read it and they have difficulty with it, they either understand it or they don't. They don't really have a lot of tools for making sense of the text. And so giving them some of these language, in this case, the examples I've used are all language cues that allow you, gee, I'm having trouble with this. Let me see if I can break out the sentences. Let me see if I can figure out the meanings of some of those words. In this case, let me see if I can follow this chain of reasoning that this author is doing to figure out what it is that he's trying to tell me or she's trying to tell me are some of the tools. Now, there are many others, some others that deal with language, but also tools that deal with the concepts themselves, tools that deal with how well the students are able to, how fluently they can read the text, and so on. The point here, folks, is that your state is asking you to teach kids to read more complex text than in the past, instead of dropping back to an instructional level. These kinds of scaffolds and many others are the tools that you and your teachers need if they're going to actually accomplish that. Let me say one last thing, and I'm going to close this up, and that is text levels should vary. Yeah, our kids should be reading a lot in school. They should be reading in their reading period. They should be reading in their science classes and social studies classes and so on. They should be reading several times throughout a day in a classroom. They should be reading every day and throughout the school year. Those texts that they're taught with should vary in difficulty. They should vary from texts that are relatively easy for them, which includes some of those books we would have said were instructional level in the past, but they also should include a number of these texts that frankly we would have avoided in the past, saying that they were frustration level. Kids are going to build strength from reading a variety of text difficulties and from learning how to confront those challenges and those complexities of the text. That's not going to happen for kids all on their own. That's going to require teaching, and that's really on us. With that, I'm going to thank you for being with us today, but I thank you for being with us every day. Your work really matters. Mike?
I'm sorry, everyone. I had to get my phone off mute there for a minute. I was challenged. So thank you, Dr. Shanahan, for a great presentation on a topic that's near and dear to many of our hearts. I know at times we come across this research that has been debunked over years, and it gets to be a little confusing for us in the field because then we don't know what to do next. So I have a question here. I work with kindergarten students. What are some examples of grade level text that I should be using to instruct these kids?
You know, with kindergartners, I'm not going to ramp up text difficulty because I want those kids to learn to decode. So that's something that's really pretty important. You know, the kinds of levels that kindergarten teachers and first grade teachers have traditionally been using are very appropriate. What you can do, however, is something that I used to do as a first grade teacher, and that is the books that you do read to these boys and girls can certainly be a lot more challenging than many of the picture books I see kindergarten teachers reading. You know, it used to be that, oh, you know, in kindergarten we read these little picture books and then we read chapter books to the older boys and girls. As a first grade teacher, you know, I didn't know any better, so I used to actually, you know, read the chapter books, things that really were introduced a lot more language to the kids and a lot more conceptual complexity. And they were certainly able to understand that and to interact with that. But on the reading end, go with things that are decodable, go with things that have fairly consistent spelling to sound patterns so that kids can actually you know, learn to use those tools when they're trying to decode a text.
Thank you, Dr. Shanahan. I think I can speak for the audience when I say we can listen to you all day. You're just a wealth of information. So I suggest to the audience, excuse me, if you're interested in more, to hear more from Dr. Shanahan, I encourage you to go to shanahanonliteracy.com. Sign up for his blog. You'll hear more of the same. But trust me, very entertaining, Dr. Shanahan.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. As a final reminder about the next presentation scheduled for Tuesday, May 15th at noon Eastern Time, we're going to have Dr. Jan Hasbrook as our guest. And again, all the sessions are recorded and posted on our website at sbsl.org for your continued learning pleasure. But also I want to remind you that each one of you that are registered for this session will be getting the recorded session of Dr. Shanahan's time with us this morning. So I hope to see you all registered for May 15th. Other sessions on the horizon after Dr. Hasbrook is MyIGD, the pre-K assessment that's been recently approved by the state of Pennsylvania. Wonders curriculum, what's hot? Skill inventories and formative assessment. What are these? How do I use them? And what's up with this new Blue Zone or recommended goals that I'm hearing about? So stay tuned for the next sessions of Straight Talk by the Experts, and I thank everyone for joining me. And again, thank you, Dr. Shanahan, for your wisdom. We really appreciate you sharing.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great week, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.